It's too late. We're everywhere. Hello and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's review for the Adversary, which is episode 26 of season 3 of Star Trek Deep Space Nine. This video is a part of a series of videos where I review episodes of Star Trek as determined by my user polls. The episode to win my Deep Space Nine user poll is The Adversary. So The Adversary is the episode where Sisko is promoted to captain, and he's defiantly sent on a mission to quell a coup d'etat on the Zinkethi homeworld by an ambassador. However, during the trip they find that the ambassador is in fact a changeling that was purposely sent him on this mission to cause raise tension and to cause a war between the Federation and the Zinkethi, and the Changeling has taken over the ship and is impersonating people at random, so Sisko and the others must struggle to discover who the Changeling is, and eventually they do, and Odo is forced to kill him, which is very sad for him, but the Changeling parts with a parting message saying it's too late, we're everywhere. So, I quite enjoyed this. This was the season 3 finale, of course, and I think this is kind of an underrated episode. It's one of my favorite Deep Space Nine. Of course, I'm a lot bigger on season 3 than a lot of people are. And I think, to me, when I think of this episode, I mainly think of how all the wasted potential, because I think this is clearly setting a direction for the show to go in that they did not. Instead, they did this Klingon War thing, and I've heard all the excuses before that, they were setting up for the Klingon War. It does have to do with the Dominion, because it's about the Changeling infiltrating Klingons to force this war, and it was foreshadowed in the episode of Dies Cast when the Romulan, who was impersonated by a Changeling, said that the Federation and Klingons were the only threat left, so it makes perfect sense that the Changelings would try to start a war between the Federation and Klingons. Yeah. That's all well and good, and that's all true enough, but we know for a fact that the writers did not have the Klingon War in mind when they were writing season 3, that it was something that was forced upon them by the studio in season 4. They were forced to change direction and forced to add war, forced to add the Klingons, and I think that's obvious. I think what they were setting up here for was more of a Changeling infiltration storyline. Now, you could argue, but Mark, they did touch on the Changeling infiltration. We got Homefront, Paradise Lost, which was a good two-parter, although the second part did pivot and make it less about the Changeling infiltration and more about an asshole Starfleet officer who tried to do his own coup. And then we got, of course, in season 5, we had Bashir was once again infiltrated by a Changeling, impersonated by a Changeling, and he tried to destroy Deep Space Nine and the entire solar system, wiping out a Klingon, Romulan Federation fleet in the process, but of course was thwarted at the last second. So you could say, well, so what are you talking about, Mark? These are follow-ups to the Changeling infiltration. And yeah, those are all well and good, but I think they could have done a lot more with it. I think because this episode in particular, I think, presents a scenario. It shows how hard it is, first of all, to discover a Changeling, and how really insidious that they can be, that they can take on the form of anything. And Odo even says in this episode, if you scan me as a rock, I'm a rock. And it shows just one Changeling on one tiny ship full of 56 people or something like that, and it took them forever to find him. And most of the main reason why they're able to find him because Odo, another Changeling, just happened to be there. So imagine how much havoc Changelings could wreak on a planet-wide scale, where instead of it not being on a confined space with just 56 people, you got millions and millions of people, and it could be anyone, and there's no Odo or other Changeling there who would be able to find them. I mean, I think they almost made them too powerful, too invincible, which is probably why they kind of laid back on this aspect. But during the Dominion War, the Changelings should have been wreaking havoc on the Alpha Quadrant and destroying the Allied forces from within. Now, one could make the argument that the Dominion War started after Sisko mined the wormhole, so you could make the argument that the female Changeling, which is the only Changeling we've saw on the Alpha Quadrant after the wormhole was shut off to the Dominion, that all the other changelings are still in the Gamma Quadrant. You could argue that, but I would say why. They should already been a whole shitload of changelings in the Alpha Quadrant, because we've seen in previous episodes that they were trying to wreak havoc. But anyway, I know I'm going off on a tangent. Not much of this has to do with the Adversary. I'm just reminded of it when watching this episode of the Adversary, because to me this lays out just what they could have done and a lot of potential that, in my opinion, was squandered. I think the few Changeling episodes we did get was not enough. I think this should have been a much bigger threat as this episode presents. And I think season 4 was a cop-out, because it began with them training about them hunting down Changelings in Deep Space Nine, but we found that it was just Odo. And then they just pivoted to be all about the Klingons. And I don't give a crap that the Klingons were infiltrated by the Changeling. That's not enough. Needed more. Needed this to be the main focus. But anyway, that's just my feeling on it. Now, getting to the actual episode itself, I think this was one of the most, I don't know if I could use the word creepy or dark, but I think it's one of the most sort of intense episodes. It has a very claustrophobic feel to it. You can really feel, and not many Star Trek shows take advantage of this, because you're in a starship, you're just in a bubble of oxygen, basically surrounded by the vacuum of space. And most Star Trek episodes, I don't think really take advantage of that and make you feel that. And particularly the Defiant, which, as far as I know, is one of the smallest starships that was the main ship for a Star Trek show. Although obviously it's not the main ship. It's about Deep Space Nine, the space station, but the Defiant was introduced in the 3rd season as the ship that Sisko and the Deep Space Nine crew will go off and take adventures on. I mean, you could argue it's not as confined as like a shuttlecraft or a runabout, but those, I think, are a bit too confined. Whereas here, it is large enough to have 50 or 60 so people move around. And so, because if you're in the shuttlecraft, it would be a lot easier to get the Changeling. But here, in a situation where it's a bit bigger, but still you feel that claustrophobic. It's not like the Enterprise or something where there'd be a lot of places to run. It's more of the Changelings nearby, but you don't know where. I think it's like the perfect scenario. And that you had that high tension throughout, and I think this is what I wanted to see more of in the future. I think they took full advantage of the fact that the Changeling is so hard to find and could virtually be anyone. It starts by imitating the Ambassador, then it imitates Bashir, then it goes back to the Ambassador, and the Ambassador's called, then it imitates Bashir again, but it actually fakes him out and makes people think they're imitating Eddington when he was imitating the Bashir the whole time. One of my favorite scenes is when they split off into two, and they all get separated, and this Bolian thinks that Kira's the Changeling, and he starts freaking out and wanting to fire at her, and so they have 5 different people, Eddington, Odo, and Sisko, and Kira and that Bolian are all separated from their partners, so any one of them could be the Changeling, so they're all freaked out about it. And I love that atmosphere, and plus it's a really foreboding episode, because they think they're going off on this mission to stop a civil war between the Zenkethi that could destabilize the whole region, but then they find out halfway there is no civil war. It was all made up by the Changeling who's impersonating the Ambassador. And then while they're on the way, by the time they figure this out, their ship has already been taken control by the Changeling. So they know that the Changeling is prepared to attack the Zenkethi, thus starting a bloody war. And there's such a ticking clock element to it. And not only is there a ticking clock because they have this much time to take down the Changeling's control, but the Changeling is actively trying to stop them from doing that. And of course, as I established, a Changeling reveal is so powerful and so insidious, it could be anyone at any time. And I think this episode really takes full advantage of that, and you can feel the high stakes and the high tension throughout this episode, which I think is absolutely amazingly well done. Like, I love, we get a kind of a cliche, it ends on kind of a cliche scene where you got Odo is chasing the Changeling. They both pop up in engineering, but the Changeling is pretending to be Odo, so you got two Odos, and O'Brien doesn't know which one to trust, so he just points the phaser at both of them. It kind of reminds me of the original Star Trek episode Whom Gods Destroy, when Lord Garth could shapeshift, and he presented as Kirk, and so Spock was stuck with two Kirks, and who do I trust? And I think this one was done a bit better, because the other one, it was like, usually the person has to deduce, oh, you're actually the nice guy because you don't want to hurt anyone. But here, he could see that, actually they did kind of do that a bit, because the other Changeling was like, I don't know, but they figured it out. And so it was a bit cliche, but I think it actually did really work in this instance, because of what they set up with the Changeling, and how if the Changeling is imitating Odo, who he himself is a Changeling, there's no way to disprove which one is which, because they're both Changelings. So that was quite powerful. And then, of course, you always had, like, foreshadowed throughout Season 3, you had this saying of, oh, no Changeling has ever harmed another. And here you have Odo kills another Changeling. And this was nicely foreshadowed earlier in the episode, how Odo was talking to Eddington, saying that he never felt, he doesn't carry a phaser because he doesn't want to kill. He never feels the need to kill. So he's very, like, pacifist in that regard, although he uses blunt force when necessary, but he tries never to use lethal force. But he's forced, like, to kill, because he has to choose between either kill this Changeling or let the Defiant be destroyed, or let the Federation, start this war with the Zenkethi, which would decimate the Federation. So he obviously takes the choice of killing the Changeling, and something you can see how much he regrets having to take that choice, and that's quite powerful. And it was also quite amazing how, I love the creepy way, the Changeling has Odo's like, I'm sorry, but the Changeling's like, come here, and whispers something into his ear, which we later learn is him saying, you're too late, we're everywhere, which I think is like a classic, creepy line to go out on. It's a classic, we're all fucked. And as I said, I don't think they did enough with it, honestly, especially in Season 4. Originally, before the studio forced the Klingon storyline on Deep Space Nine, they had originally planned for the opening two-parter to be what would become Homefront and Paradise Lost. And I think in that original outline, it would focus more on the Changeling aspect of it. And I think that's what we should have gotten. But I think and they should have done more with Changeling infiltration. They kind of actually forgot about it. We got that one Bashir thing in Season 5, but after Season 5, they kind of like, Changelings, Smangelings. And they kind of just forgot about this whole thing, which kind of irritates me, to be honest. I think they could have done a lot more with it. But, as a standalone episode on its own, I think it's amazing. I do think it is very powerful. Particularly how they fake you out when O'Brien sees Bashir in the next junction that was sabotaged, so O'Brien assumes it was Bashir, and he goes to Bashir. He's like, oh, I thought it was you. He's like, what are you talking about? I was never there. And at the same time, you see them scanning the ambassador, and he's like, he gives this really creepy smile before he transforms into a Changeling. That was just such an effective, creepy scene. And it's kind of interesting that they had the same actor who plays the ambassador was also the same actor who played the Changeling, which they didn't have to do because the Changeling is just impersonating the ambassador. But whatever. I mean, the Changeling doesn't really have a true humanoid form, so its version of Odo could be based off of the ambassador. So that makes as much sense as anything else. But yeah, I thought the character interactions we get at the start with Sisko being promoted to captain is obviously something the show always wanted to do. I think this Irish Stephen Bear was really pushing for that once he took over in Season 3. He was thinking, even though, technically he's supposed to be a commander in charge of the station, screw that, Sisko should be a captain. And of course you got him sporting the goatee, which I think started a few episodes earlier, and then of course season 4's head shave as well. So you're starting to get into the more leaner Captain Sisko that we come to know in later seasons. But yeah, a complaint I do have about this episode is the Zenkethi. Who the hell are the Zenkethi? They're only mentioned in this one episode. They're never really mentioned again. I think there's a lot of like beta canon and stuff that tries to do more with them and mention. I think they might have been name dropped again in Deep Space Nine later, but they never really played an important part, and that kind of irritates me. You have all these well-established species and races in existence already. Why do you have to invent one just for this one episode to be like, oh, they're going to have the Civil War, so there's some alien race that we never heard of before. Oh, I think they are name dropped in Homefront, if I remember correctly, because the Admiral was like reminiscing with Sisko on how they faced down a couple of Zenkethi ships or something. But that irritates me, to be honest. And so there's some like maps and stuff that show the Zenkethi as like a major Alpha Quadrant power, and yet they're only mentioned really in this one episode. Apparently in season 7, when the Dominion make an alliance with the Breen, it was one of the original ideas floated is that they would make an alliance with the Zenkethi, which I think would have been just as interesting, because the Breen, again, are another race that were barely mentioned. But they were actually mentioned a lot more than the Zenkethi. So maybe it would have been better to do the Zenkethi to actually say, hey, these guys are actually important. I always wonder what a Zenkethi looks like. Anyway, yeah. And other than that, like, this episode also, the writers, the producers wanted this to be a two-parter, a season, like, you know, end season 3 in part 1 and begin season 3 in part 4. But begin season 4 in part 2. But for some reason, the studio didn't want Deep Space Nine to do that. I don't know, because Next Generation did that every year, and then Voyager started doing that every year. But for some reason, they didn't want Deep Space Nine to do that. In fact, in future seasons, they will hold them back from doing that. Although you could argue Call to Arms was a straight-up cliffhanger, but it wasn't a part 1, part 2 situation. That was a 7-part situation, so that's different. And then, not really with Tear of the Prophets. I mean, that left on sort of a cliffhanger, but that's not exactly a part 1, part 2 situation. But anyway, I mean, kind of, but not really. But, and I probably talked about this before. Like, my brother and I had this running joke about how instead of having a cliffhanger, you know, a 2-parter cliffhanger like Next Generation or Voyager would do, Deep Space Nine elects to just have Odo say something shocking at the end, which really only happened 2 years, but 2 years in a row. Because this is, you know, this time the episode ends with Odo saying it's too late, we're everywhere. And then season 4 ends with Odo saying, oh, Gowron's a changeling. So it's like we made fun of that as it was kind of a cop-out, that it was, instead of actually, they should have just done a proper cliffhanger, and it's kind of half-assing it just to have Odo saying something shocking, which I think they did change in like season 5 and 6, which were more like proper cliffhangers, particularly season 5. That was a Call to Arms. That was a proper cliffhanger, whereas Odo saying something shocking is kind of a cop-out, I think. And I think that was the studio holding the producers back, who did actually want to do a proper cliffhanger, which I don't know why the fuck the studio would do this. They're okay with Next Generation, Deep Space Nine doing, or Voyager doing it, but not Deep Space Nine for some reason. I don't get it. But anyway, I don't think this is. It makes it even more of a powerful standalone episode, though. So I will grant it that. Anyway, so my rating for the Adversary out of 10 is a 9 excellent. Not quite a 10. Because it doesn't, I don't think it actually goes that extra mile, but it does have that right, like, really well executed tone of suspense and creepiness and just high tension, and that feeling of claustrophobia and the feeling of being up against a really powerful adversary. And so I think the title of the episode is right on. And as I said, the character beats without it were nicely set up for and everything. It's just, I do think they could have done a little more of this episode. Maybe that's why it doesn't quite earn a 10, but it's really close. And I will say it is one of my favorite Deep Space Nine episodes. So anyway, that is it for my review of The Adversary. Thank you so much for watching this. Be sure to check out my channel as I do many more Star Trek videos, as well as many other videos on other shows like Mr. Robot, Lost, The Expanse, and more. So be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all that. And thanks a lot for watching.